series where we are discussing mental health. If you are new to joining us tonight, we are going to have some video teaching from Kelsey, and then we will be back to have a conversation around that topic. So stick around, be sure to ask questions. We will be able to respond to those towards the end of the video or of our class, and we will see you here in just a little bit.
Our online class where we're talking kind of about our mental state, kind of about the reality that we all have stuff in our lives that we need to talk about. And we're super excited to continue the journey with the church in Philippi and Paul and their relationship, but also just to kind of sit and reflect a little bit. Last week we had an incredible challenge to get uncomfortable, to realize that our messes were not actually helping us, but they were actually holding us back. And so this week we're going to continue and just actually look at what our mess is. I remember when I was working at my church in Arizona, there was this season where we had a gentleman come to us and he's like, I want to start a Celebrate Recovery group on campus. And Celebrate Recovery is a little bit like AA, but with a little bit more of a gospel Jesus-centric focus. And so we were like, you know what, we're down to start with you. But we really didn't understand what it was. In my mind, I kind of had this perspective of they're going to go over there and talk about their addictions, and I'm going to stay over here with the people that don't have addictions, and we're just going to continue to live life normally. But he challenged me to join him. And for me, I'm someone that straight up, if I'm being honest on a day, and I don't always like to be honest about this one, I have addictive tendencies. I have things that have destroyed me, that have hurt me, that have wounded me at my own hands. But the reality is, for most of us, we sit here and we go, that's not me, that's not for me. And as I began to journey with him, the people that ended up coming to Celebrate Recovery were everybody. And it became our slogan over the next year that if you're breathing, you're broken. And we would repeat that nonstop. If you're breathing, you're broken, because sometimes in our world we define brokenness as, well, one of the big ones, right? Drug, sex, and alcohol were the ones that, even in the 80s, like that was the big joke. It's drug, sex, and alcohol. Stay away from those. But the reality is, all of us have something. All of us have something we grab hold of because we're breathing. If we're breathing, we're broken. And if we're broken, all of us want to do one of two things. One, fix everything so nothing can be broken. Or two, stop feeling any of it so that we can just exist. So my question for us today is, what's your broken? Okay, yeah, maybe it's one of the three that were famous in the 80s. But maybe it's when you hit buy on Amazon and that rush that you get for just a few moments because you can't deal with your real life, and that rush feels good, and it feels good for a few moments until the next day when something else happens in your life that you don't like, and so you go back to that rush again. Or maybe you're like me and you use most of your situations are covered with humor, and often self-deprecating humor, where you just poke fun at yourself because at least then I can keep people from seeing what's actually going on, and I'm in control of the narrative. Maybe you're addicted to relationships and you go from relationship to relationship to relationship. Maybe you have your issues in your own home. And outside, everything looks great, but on the inside of your home, it's constant yelling, it's constant fighting, or you disappear to a room in your house and you don't exist to anyone anymore. And you numb out. Maybe it's television, which the addition of things like Disney Plus and Netflix have radically transformed our ability to just tune out for a few minutes. For Paul, as he's working with this church in Philippi, they begin to wrestle with their own vices. And Philippi, each within that home church would have their own vices, their own issues, and they were very aware of the fact that they had them. They had things they had to work through. But for Paul, it was a little different. You see, Paul was raised as a Jewish man. He knew the Jewish law, the Old Testament, incredibly well. In fact, he was so educated in it that he could probably quote almost all of it to you if he was sitting here with us. He wanted to follow it. For Paul, you see, for him, he didn't need to numb out with different vices to stop feeling. He needed to prove his own worth, his own value. And so he had to prove that he was perfect, and he was honestly addicted to that perfection, to everything being exactly the way it's supposed to be. And so there were 600 plus laws, and he followed every single one of them. He loved them. He lived for them. But then throughout, he actually begins to use this law to destroy other people because he's so passionate about perfection that it actually begins to harm the people around him. Than perfection. And so there's more than living to the law. There's something so much more profound in the freedom of the relationship. In fact, as he's writing to this church in Philippi, he kind of starts this conversation out with them, and he says, listen, we have to stay away from evil. That's not a choice. We need to deal with our own vices. We need to address them. And then in chapter 3, he kind of owns his own vices, and he says this in chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. He says, indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. I want to pause there because we would initially hear that and we'd go, okay, yeah, give up your vices, give up alcohol, give up television, give up social media, and we'd go, yeah, give that all up. But for him, he's giving up perfection. The whole section right before is how he tried to live so perfectly, and he's like, I give that all up. Why? Because knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, is way more important, way more beautiful, way more impactful. I remember in therapy, my therapist used to tell me, you know, you can give up your vices, but if you don't fill it with the right thing, you're just going to fill it with a new vice. For Paul, he gives us the answer to that. If we're going to remove these things that we numb out with, or these things that we get perfect with, we have to replace it with the one and only thing that is far superior. And for Paul, it's Jesus. It is the only thing. Because if I'm going to give up my eating disorder, I'm going to replace it with perfection in another way. Or I'm going to replace it with some other vice. For me, it can often be, even now, television. But if I can replace it with the one thing that is far superior, things can change. And he continues, for his sake, for God's sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ. In this moment, he looks and he says, all these other things that we keep going to, they're rubbish, they're garbage. He literally says these other vices that we attach to are garbage, worthy of being thrown out. Now, to be fair, is television garbage? Well, some of it probably is. But is it all garbage? No, but in comparison to knowing Jesus, 100%. And I look back at my life in those moments where I was clinging so tightly to things that made me feel perfect or in control, and at times numb me out. And I think, Jesus is worth so much more. Those things are garbage. But we have to call it what it is. So what's your thing? You're breathing, so you're broken. So you have something that you're attaching to, and it seems to be serving some purpose for you. It's doing something for you, but at what cost? And could you give it up? Because the joy of knowing Jesus is that much better, because life with Jesus is better. Are you ready to own your own rubbish? Are you ready to put that out there and say, I've got to work through this thing? Just like Paul, who he still lived by the law in quite a few areas of his life. He ultimately said, I don't need to be perfect. I need to know Jesus. Are you ready to say, I don't need that bottle. I don't need to click purchase. I don't need that television show. I don't need that app on my phone. I don't need that friend who I have become so attached to that it's unhealthy for me. Are you ready to say no to that because of what Jesus has for you instead? Are you ready to put that out?
Hey, welcome back, everybody. My name's Dustin Kirchner, and I'm the Connections Pastor here at Eastern Hills. Just wanted to say sorry about the audio problem. We noticed that in the video, and what we're going to do is actually just post a cleaned up version that you'll be able to watch later. If you want to go back, it's a great talk from Kelsey. Definitely don't want you to miss out on that. But we're going to jump right into our conversation today with Liz Fetaplace and Carrie Chatterton. Carrie, do you want to just give us a quick recap of maybe kind of the context of Kelsey's talk and what we're going to talk about today?
Sure. So Kelsey had a great talk. We're so sorry that there were some issues with it. We really hope that you take the time to go back and watch it. So just to really make it as much in a nutshell as I can, it really is just saying that we all have stuff. We all have things that we kind of lean towards and that we fall into, and that's a way that we cope with our bigger issue. And so basically, if we have this addiction and we're trying to work through it, and what we do is instead of turning to Jesus, if we just get rid of the symptoms, we're going to find another addiction to get into. The only cure for that is to find ourselves connected with Jesus. It goes along with the theme of the church that Jesus makes life better, and Kelsey does a great job of explaining that. So please try to check that out in a little bit when we have that posted. And thank you for being gracious with us. We're all human, we all have issues, and this is just an example of that. So thank you for being gracious.
Hey, and so as we get started, I do have a question from last week that came up that I thought would be a good place to start before we kind of get into our more of our topic for the week. So question from last week: how do I know when I'm using a healthy coping mechanism and when I am avoiding my problem, like coping too much, right, in that way?
And I think it's a great question. I'm so glad that we're addressing it. A lot of times we have something little in our life that sort of makes us feel better, right? Like, man, I had a rough day. It would be great to just stop by Dairy Queen and get an ice cream cone. I'm just really down. There's this thing on Amazon I'd really like to get, so I'm just going to buy that and cheer me up a little bit. So really, if we look at those things, there's nothing evil about any of those things. It really comes down to an issue of moderation. So if this is something you do from time to time, it's just something that kind of makes me feel better, it lifts my spirits, fine. I don't have an issue with that. Where it becomes an issue is when it's not in moderation, when it's, I have to have this to get through my day. I can't get out of bed without doing this thing. I know that this is going to happen various times throughout the day or the week because I can't live without that. Kelsey makes mention even of relationships. We can have friends like that. Well, I can't get through this without so-and-so. Well, then that might be a codependent relationship that's not healthy. Now, obviously, there are things that we can't do in moderation. These are things that we know that there are clear guidelines in the Bible that talk about things such as sexual sin. You can't be in moderation with pornography. You can't be in moderation with sexual encounters. Things that cross the line, obviously there's no moderation. We're talking about normal, everyday, healthy things that you can do that can get out of hand if it just goes on and becomes something that you have to get through a day.
Can you speak a little bit to perhaps the reason why people seek out those alternatives to numb pain or, kind of instead of facing what they're really facing head on? Yeah. Can you kind of dive into that a little bit more?
I think for anybody, it's very scary to get down to what the issue is. I have a lot of people who will say, oh my goodness, if I start talking about this, the floodgates are going to open and I'm never going to be able to calm down. It's going to be terrible, which I would say is very rarely the case, but people fear it. So instead, it's like, I don't want to think about this. I don't want to deal with this, but this distracts me for a little bit. This makes me feel better for a little bit. And so I can latch on to this. And for some reason, for whatever, it calms me down. It makes me feel better for a little bit. So this works. And so it's really an avoidance. And avoidance is not something that we want to do. Avoidance is not healthy.
And where do you think the turning point is when someone goes from using something to avoid to an addiction?
I think it really starts becoming that as soon as it becomes something to avoid. When it's like a distraction, that's fine. Distraction sometimes we need. We were talking earlier about sometimes we have this big thing come up in our life that's in our face, and it's like, I can't deal with this right now. I have to go to work. I have to take care of my kids. I have to be engaging in my relationship. And you can set that down for a little bit, and you sometimes need something to distract. When you're using it to avoid, when I'm never going to think about this, I'm never going to deal with this, then we start to worry about it becoming an addiction. So finding out, is this something that I'm just using for right now to get me through the moment to where later I can deal with the big issue? Or is this something that I am using all the time so I never have to think about the real issue?
That's good.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So last week, we talked about the stages of change, and you talked to us specifically about pre-contemplation, like before we're aware of our issue.
Right.
Would you just give us a quick rundown of those stages again, and then maybe a little bit more of a detailed explanation of the one we're talking about this week?
Yeah. So last week we did talk about pre-contemplation, and that's where it's like, oh, I probably don't have an issue, I don't have a problem, it's fine. And that's someone who's not quite ready to change. Contemplation, where hopefully, we're kind of going to sit on for a little bit this week, is where it's like, yep, I got a problem. I've got something I've got to deal with, and I'm going to start thinking about how to get through that. And then after that, we look into action and maintenance, which is now I'm actively trying to work through this, or I have worked through this and I'm going to maintain this new change in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So give us a little bit more about that second stage then, contemplation.
Yeah.
And how does it affect kind of our idea of coping mechanisms and what we're using as potentially addictions?
Absolutely. When we get to the stage of contemplation, we get to this place where we're almost like excited, like we're going to change. Something's going to happen in our life and we're going to make these improvements and we're going to do this new thing. And so at this point, we're saying a change needs to happen. So how do I do that? In this stage, I think it's really important for us to get down to the place where we're just looking at basics of what can I change? What can I absolutely not change? And that's something that we've heard for a long time. If you've ever heard the serenity prayer, Lord, help me to accept the things I cannot change. Help me to have the courage to change the things I can. And that's really what we're talking about in contemplation. So a really solid example of this is maybe you grew up in a home where there was abuse in your childhood. Maybe you had some trauma growing up. Well, as much as you want to say, it's fine, it doesn't really matter, I can just, move on without it, I don't have to think about it, I don't have to process it, it's not going to be quieted with that. And so that's where the addictions start coming in. That's where a vice comes in. That's where something takes over to make me stop thinking about that thing that I don't want to accept. So when we get to the point where we can go into something called radical acceptance, which is saying, yeah, this happened to me. This is a part of my story. This is a part of my life. You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it. You can absolutely hate that it's a part of your story, but you're saying it is. This is part of who I am. This is part of me. There's nothing I can do to change it. And then you say, but what can I change? Where can I go from here? Am I going to allow this to keep defining me? Am I going to allow this to keep pushing me into the addictions that we're talking about, the things that make me numb? Or am I going to say, no, this is something that I can work through. This is something I can process. This is something that I can overcome by the grace of God, with His help, with community around me.
So when someone is working towards radical acceptance, is that something that someone can do on their own, or is that something that someone should seek out professional help for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really comes down to where you are in your life. I think there's a lot of times that we can say, I'm in a good place. Maybe I'm supported by close people in my life, good friends, a good relationship. So I think with that support, I can do this. There are other times that this is not a great relationship for me. This is not the kind of friendships that I feel safe in sharing this with. And because it will open up a lot of emotion, it will open up a lot of pain, it will open up questions that maybe you've never thought of before. If you're in a situation where you can't look around you and in your immediate circle see good, strong, healthy support, that's when I would say you should seek out a counselor. Seek out a counselor. Or, we have things even within the church, different groups, where there are some people who are really willing to help and to help you work through that. But I would say it's not something to ever do on your own. To look around, see what kind of support you have, and that's where you're going to be able to decide, this is something I can do sort of in-house, as opposed to I do need some professional help.
So you talked about kind of a big example of childhood abuse, like trauma in your past. What are some more like day-to-day type things that people might be experiencing on a regular basis and not even realize that they're sort of avoiding?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I would say sometimes it's something as simple as anger. It's something as simple as, I had this interaction and there was something about it that just infuriated me. And trying to get to the bottom of that, trying to say, what was that? Did that person remind me of somebody in my past, in my youth, that would criticize me? And so as soon as somebody who reminds me of that comes along, boom, I'm right back to that place. Because we can also say, well, that was just terrible, so you know what, I'm just going to get online and I'm going to get so involved in social media for the next 4 hours that I don't think about it.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have to be a major thing. Sometimes it is a major thing, but sometimes it's like, man, there's something about me that just gets angry so easy. There's something about me that just gets frustrated so easy. There's something about me that puts all this pressure on myself. Where does that come from? And being able to sort through the vices, sort through the distractions, sort through the numb, and say, I've got to sit with this and I've got to find out what that is.
And that could be also really like what the trigger is.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And then becoming aware of what that trigger is so you can identify it again next time and hopefully kind of have less of a reaction.
Absolutely.
Each time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will say, just from a personal example, I just grew up in a environment where girls were very often put down. Girls were very often, without saying it, we're like, well, they're not quite as smart. They're not quite as good leaders and things like that. For me, for years, anytime a male would criticize me, I just felt like I was going to come unglued. And I'm not that person.
Yeah.
It takes a lot to get me angry, but man, if my intelligence was insulted, I just couldn't handle it. I would be so upset and I would become this person I didn't like. And so when I could go back to say, oh my goodness, I know where that comes from. I know where that comes from. I have to deal with that. I have to find forgiveness for those people who did that and made me feel that way. Then I can move past it. And then I'm not jumping over the handlebars when it's not a situation that calls for that.
Yeah, I think for a personal example, for me, I've been working through some of that stuff too. And so I've been even like doing an exercise, like when I feel like there's like something that's triggering me, I've kind of talked through like what are some of the things that are triggers for me. And then I have a little notepad that I would carry around. And like every time I felt that trigger, I would like make a check mark to interrupt what that was, that thought, and to like, so I could identify it and then go back and say like, oh, it was maybe someone didn't meet an expectation or I felt disrespected or something like that, that then I could identify where that came from and then move forward from it. And so then I've noticed that as I've been working through that for the past several months, like, oh, I'm not so triggered anymore.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work and it's a lot of intentional, I think, thought process.
And that's really where it is. And I love that example. I love that because you put the check mark and it stops you, right? It stops you in the moment to go, what is this? What's going on? What's really going on? And that's really the whole thing that we're talking about here. You're saying, I'm not going to let myself get distracted. I'm not even going to get caught up in the emotion. I'm going to stop and focus, feel this feeling in my body, and try to go back to where does this come from? And that's a big part of it too. I'd say mindfulness and being comfortable with the being still, even if it's for 30 seconds, even if it's for 10 seconds. We just don't have that opportunity in the life that we live. So just stopping to reflect, I think, is really good.
Liz is better at doing that in the moment. I do it later on, a couple days later.
Not always.
Right.
Not always.
Exactly.
But it gets done. But it gets done. So give yourself grace there.
Sometimes I have to go back and identify, like, because I do have those moments.
Sure.
I'm not perfect with it, and yes, I've made progress, but I still will blow up, and then I'm like, okay, let's trace back. Because I didn't stop it then. Then I can trace back to like, this was led to this led to this led to this, and so then I can kind of identify it.
And that's a great thing to remember too, because when we're talking about this, I have to remind myself, if I have been this way for 38 years, I'm not going to change overnight. I'm not going to change in a month, but I can make progress. So being able to celebrate that progress. So even if it is a couple days later, I can go back, well, man, I wasn't doing that a couple years ago, and always acknowledging the progress. We're never going to be perfect. Never. And if this has been our tendency for years and years, of course we're going to fall back into it. It's just what we're used to, what we're comfortable with. But when we can really say, but look at the progress I've made, that helps a lot.
So I have a feeling there's somebody out there watching this and thinking to themselves, how do I know if I know? Like if I'm in pre-contemplation, if I'm in uncertainty, how do I really know when I'm aware of my stuff? Like what's going on internally? What advice do you give somebody in that position that maybe isn't sure if they've figured it all out or if they totally understand their internal?
Sure. You know, I think it's always a progress. It's always a journey. We're never going to like arrive. We're always going to be working on these things. We're always going to get it better. But I'd say don't overthink it. You know, if you're asking yourself that question, most likely you're in contemplation. You know, if I'm like, well, am I there? Am I working on this? Well, you've identified something. You know, so don't overthink it. Don't be going, well, but am I thinking of the right thing? Well, but you found something. So work on that. You know, we are such complex people that we can keep digging and finding more and more things. But if you have identified something, go with that. And that's great. Just don't overthink it, which is me preaching to the choir here, right? Like, man, I need that lesson a lot.
Yeah, and so what are some things, we were talking before we came live about kind of maybe understanding who we are, and I think that kind of helps too when you have some self-awareness and kind of know who you are. Do you want to speak into that a little bit more about kind of how that helps people kind of know when they're making some progress?
So if you've been around Eastern Hills for any length of time, I feel like especially in the last year, you've probably heard of the Enneagram. It is a great personality test that really, when you find your number, right, because there's numbers assigned to it, 1 through 9, I believe. When you find your number, you start to read and you're like, oh my goodness, that's me. And I totally do that. And there are parts of it that step on your toes that you're like, oh, I do that too. I don't really love that, but it's true. Yeah. But when you start to see that and know who you are, you're better able to identify some triggers. You're better able to relate to people. You're better able to know, wow, I can also go to this really unhealthy place sometimes. Yes. And catch yourself before you go there. So I would say doing things like that to better know yourself is great. So the Enneagram, there's lots of tests online. There's a great book, I think, that we recommend, The Road Back to You.
Yeah, The Road Back to You is a great book. You can actually take a test, a free test at yourenneagramcoach.com, and it's a Christian-based test. So love to point people to that. It's Beth McCord. She's Your Enneagram Coach. Great resources from her, and also Ian Morgan-Cron and Suzanne Stabile from The Road Back to You. Yeah. It's really why you do what you do. It is. Which is so helpful.
It is, and so eye-opening. And some people do it, and they're like, oh, well, I'm a 6 or I'm a whatever. And then some people are like, I'm a 2, and I'm going to learn everything I can about 2s, because they really get into it, and they start seeing the value in it. Yeah. And on the flip side of that, knowing who God is, right? Yeah. Because God is the one who ultimately tells us who we are. He tells us the truth about who we are. So we really need to know who God is too, and to know his true character. A lot of us, I think, grew up with this idea of God was just like our dad. And if you had a wonderful dad, that's great. If you didn't have such a wonderful dad, that's not great. Some people grow up with this idea that he was this like grandfather in heaven just waiting for you to mess up. So we have a lot of misconceptions of who God is. And so I would say that knowing more about God's character, who he really is, how he sees us, that changes everything. Because that's the way that we're truly going to replace the addictive stuff with Jesus. Yeah. That's a practical way. That's learning about who God is, learning who I am and who God says that I am, and who God really is. Not that he's this guy that's just waiting for us to mess up, but that he offers grace and love and peace. And he wants to make your life better. It won't be easier, but it will be better. And so we were talking a little bit about some books to recommend. I mean, obviously, we have the ultimate book. We can always go to the Bible. If you are new to faith, that might be a little intimidating. Yeah. Even if you're not new to faith, sometimes it's intimidating. And it's nice to read somebody else's way that they have worked through it. So you had a really good recommendation.
Yeah, I would say if there's someone out there that is looking for a place to start with understanding God's character and how we can relate to him, Tim Keller has a book called The Prodigal God, which I just love. Just very basic, like how God interacts with us and how he has grace with us in like real life. It's super helpful. Recommend it strongly.
Yeah. And just the idea of that, you know, I think another thing that we really want to stress in this class is just we do feel that we all have stuff we can work on, which is great. It's great, and it's wonderful that we have the opportunity to, and we're here to support that. But no matter where you are, no matter what stage you're in, Jesus loves you right where you're at. He has unconditional, complete love for you right where you're at. So we want you to get better. We know just the joy that can come from that. We know the growth that can come from that. We want the vices to go away, but we don't want anybody to think that you have to do that first.
Yes, that you don't have to be perfect.
Right.
Or to be past all of your stuff to be worthy of God's love. Yeah,
exactly.
He just loves you as you are.
Yeah, and there's nothing that you have done, there's nothing that you're in that is going to separate you from that. And, you know, in talking about that, there was a great point made this weekend, I think, by Kelsey when she said, you know, sometimes we're like, well, we don't want to acknowledge it because it's kind of our secret. And here's the hard truth. Like, Jesus already knows. He already knows everything. So the secret's out. But it's interesting because somebody explained it to me like this once. Even if you knew that your best friend had done something incredible, you want to hear it from them. Even if you knew that your best friend did something horrible, you want to hear it from them. So even though Jesus knows, he still wants to hear it from you. And that's safe to do. Because like we said before, right where you're at, he loves you completely. So don't be afraid of that. Don't run from that. Don't think it's some type of secret. The secret is out. We don't say that to make you feel uncomfortable. We say that so you find freedom in it.
Yeah, that is so freeing and so comforting to find that freedom there. Yeah.
So I'm going to pull up some questions and see if pull up the comments and see if we got any questions.
Sure.
But what you don't know, which we forgot to tell you before, is that Liz and I are both huge Enneagram nerds. So maybe you guys can just take a second and talk through some of that self-discovery stuff from the Enneagram a little bit in more detail. Liz is a 1, I'm a 3.
I'm a 2,
there you
a
go.
big 1, I'm a big 2.
Super helpful for me. As far as like being aware of what's going on and how I feel and how I think of things, super, super helpful. So let me look those up and you guys can maybe take that on.
Yeah, I think for me as a 1, I tend to fall within being perfect, looking, appearing good, not appearing bad, like fearing getting in trouble, all of those kinds of things. And that is affecting the way that I've lived my life, really. And so I've kind of really been digging through that, especially relationships at home and with my kids and all those kinds of things. And so as I've done some private counseling, coaching, it's the Enneagram has really been helpful for me in like understanding, why do I do this? And okay, I want to work through this. So how can I, as a 1, work through this? And what are the things do I need to be aware of? And the lady that I've been working with is like, oh, well, this is when you're going to your unhealthy here. And I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense now. And so, yeah, it's just been, I think for me, a really, like, over the past year, a really great journey of self-awareness and understanding who I am. And then really being able to, like, better myself, which as a 1, I'm all for bettering myself and kind of reforming and as she says, bringing order out of chaos. And so, yeah, that's just been, I think, really helpful for me.
Yeah, and I think that is. It's really powerful when you can know more about you and know where you go in those times.
Yeah.
So I'm a 2 with a wing of 1. So I apologize. If you don't know the Enneagram, we're like speaking Chinese here.
Yes.
But you get really into it. So for me, I'm a helper, which is, it totally fits my life. It fits my career. You know, I chose to go into mental health because I want to help people. And the thing that really gets me is that when I'm not being appreciated, I get resentful. And in my unhealthy state, I go to another number where I get very confrontational, which is so not who I am.
Yeah.
But just knowing that, I have been able to stop myself so many times and go, stop. This isn't who you are. You're feeling stressed, you're feeling angry, you're feeling tired, take a breath. This isn't who you are. Come back to you. So I would agree. It's great to know those things and to be able to catch where you're going to places you don't want to go.
Yeah, and I think when you're in, even when we talk back to like pre-contemplation and contemplation, like when you understand why you do something, then you can kind of have a better understanding of like maybe what your issue is and why you're avoiding it and the things that you need to do to kind of to become healthier and move out of that.
It's such a light bulb moment.
It is.
You know, when you're just like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then that's where the change really starts.
Yeah. So I think for me, like I had a revelation this weekend that actually Kelsey said on the stage, and I guess in the spirit of being candid and vulnerable here, like my thing is that I am experiencing like a broken relationship with my kids because I expected them to be perfect. And so now that I've identified that, now I'm like, okay, where do I go from here in that? Because perfectionism is like so much of like how I'm wired, not in going to it in a healthier way, not in an unhealthy way. And so now I'm like, okay, now I need to move forward, and how do I repair that going forward? And so that's I think where I'm now identified my issue, and now I'm like contemplating and kind of working on like, okay, how can I start
What's my
taking
next
action?
step?
What's my next step?
Yeah.
In that?
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
See, I told you. Enneagram nerds.
We could go all night.
Yeah, exactly.
We won't.
So I didn't see any questions come in for us right now, but hey, if you're watching and you have a question that maybe you didn't feel comfortable asking in front of everyone, you can send us a private message on that Facebook page, and we can chat after we're done. Or if you have a question you want us to talk about maybe next week, post that and let us know before that. But before we go, what advice do you have that's practical for people to say, okay, if you're here, here's kind of your next step.
Here's your next step. So I would say a really big thing that I think we've talked about a little bit already is just that knowing who you are is not necessarily the issue. We have to sometimes separate the issue from ourselves. I have this trauma in my life. I have this anger I deal with. Not that I am this. Because God tells us we're so much more than that. We're so much more than that. So we don't want to identify just that. You know, I think about when Kelsey talked about the world of eating disorders, and I worked in the field of eating disorders for a while, and it was like, you're not a number on a scale. You know, you're not this behavior, this binging and purging or whatever. That's not you. That's something you do. So if we can take that and kind of put it outside of us and say, okay, Lord, now help me with this. Doing that is a big thing, to identify it and externalizing it. Some therapists recommend naming it. You can do that if that's your thing. If that seems really weird, that's okay too. But just taking it outside of you and saying, this isn't who I am, this is something I'm dealing with, as well as going back to that radical acceptance versus change. What are the things that I can't change? I can't change. I don't have to like them. I don't have to agree with them. I just have to accept that that's part of what's going on right now. Aside from that, what can I change? What can I do for me? I can't control anybody else, but I can control my behaviors. I can control my next steps. So how do I do that? Starting to identify those things, they're really big things. And so this week, that would be my encouragement to you. Try to externalize that thing that you need to work on, knowing that God says you're so much more because you are. And then also trying to decipher, what can I change? What can't I change? What's something that maybe has been difficult for me that I need to just finally say, yeah, this is part of my story, but it's not my entire story, and moving on from there.
That's so good.
Yeah. Solid stuff.
Yeah. I think great. Thank you for being here tonight.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's so helpful. We hope that you guys have found it helpful as well. As Dustin said, we will hang out here for a little while. If you've got a question that you'd like to ask Carrie, maybe after the class you don't feel comfortable posting in the comments, please do so. Carrie is a rock star about responding. So even if you're thinking about this through the week and maybe something comes up on Thursday or Friday and you have a question that you want to ask us, please message our page. Carrie is monitoring. She's answering questions fairly quickly, and we are here to help. We feel this is such an important topic to be able to talk through, to bring light to, and we really want you to find healing in the things that you're dealing with. So thank you so much for joining us today. We will be back next week for week 3. We can't wait to be back. Yeah, all right.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a good one.